Thank you. It's nice to be here again. We all talk about teaching plain language, but far too often, even when we teach those techniques, we find that law students and then new lawyers especially just stop using those techniques. The question is, how can we reach those people in a sustainable way? My talk today began as a roundtable discussion at the Plain Conference back in Vancouver several years ago. And since then, I've done some research, made some observations, and from that discussion, I've come up with 6 challenges that I think we're facing when we're trying to accomplish that goal. And these are different challenges than the ones we are so used to talking about. You know, we're talking about legalese, and we need terms of art and all of that. These are different challenges. The first is, I am pressing it firmly. More firmly. Where, I don't know. There we go. There we go. Maybe this is we write what we read. And I don't know if this is a global problem, but in the United States over the past few decades, we have found that students come to law school without having read nearly as much as generations before them. So when we try to teach legal writing, we start at a disadvantage because these students have had very little experience reading excellent examples of good writing. They truly don't know what good writing looks like. So how do we combat that? We require them to read thousands of pages of really awful writing. Okay? In the United States, we estimate that we expect law students to read between 300 and 450 pages of text each week during the 3 years they're in law school. So we're talking about somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 pages every year for 3 years. It's a sustained effort. Think about what marketers do. They repeat words, messages, tunes, jingles over and over and over in an effort to build brand loyalty. We should not be surprised that after thousands of pages, day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out, that students have internalized legalese. How can we expect anything different? We couldn't accomplish this more if we attempted to brainwash them, which is essentially what we're doing with what we're expecting them to read. But while they didn't start out with a good background in reading, they do have a lot of writing experience, which leads us to the second obstacle. We're creatures of habit. Most students, in my experience, have written quite a bit before they come to law school. They've written quite a few papers. And when they get nervous about this new type of writing, this legal writing, they revert back to what they know, because that's what we do. We're creatures of habit. If we're nervous about something, we revert back. When I attended college, university, every writing assignment started with this instruction. Your essay must be at least this many pages. And every student groaned, right? Oh, how can I come up with that many pages on this? Now, we know that that minimum page requirement is supposed to accomplish a depth of treatment of the subject, but that's not how students see it. So what do? They learn to use fillers. They pad their writing. Long sentences, unnecessary repetition, passive voice, okay? They fall, and so we make them read horrible writing, and then we give them assignments, and they fall back on what they already know. And this worked for them. They were rewarded for being good academic writers, right? So let's turn to the next obstacle. When we're not sure about something, we try to cover it up and hide it. These are novices. They're novice professional writers. They're novice professional thinkers. They're insecure. They don't really know what they want to say. They feel like imposters. So what do? They fake it. They try to hide what they don't know. And how do they do it? by adding even more unnecessary words, by repeating the things that they don't know in even more vague terms, because maybe no one will notice, right? If they add enough fluff, maybe no one will notice that they don't really know what they're saying. And at least it will sound good. And they've been rewarded for that type of writing. It falls right into what they already know. But for all that they don't know, there is one thing that most lawyers, including new lawyers, do know, or they believe they know, and that is that they are great writers. Okay? So our next obstacle in reaching them in a sustainable way is that novices tend to think they're experts. They tend to think that they know more than they do. I encountered this all the time as a professor. We would hand back the first papers and the students would say, "How can you give me this grade? I'm an excellent writer. Everyone in my whole life has always told me I'm an excellent writer." But they're not. Okay? They've achieved good grades, good marks in some circles, especially academic writing, but they're not good legal writers. Okay? They could be, but they're not. Are you familiar with the Dunning Kruger effect? Who knows about this? Okay. Well, stated loosely, this is the tendency of unskilled people to believe that they are much better at something than they are. In other words, they are cognitively unable to recognize their own lack of skill. Okay? A little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, and I'm sure you've seen this in a lot of areas. Someone learns a little bit, they get a little bit of knowledge, and suddenly they're the experts. Okay? And it's only years later that they look back on that in shame and say, should have kept my mouth shut. I didn't really know what I was talking about. Brian Garner, which is a name that's familiar to many of you here, he wrote a short article about this some time ago, I think for the American Bar Association Journal. And he found in his studies that lawyers have a fairly consistent tendency to believe that they're excellent writers. Okay? This is widespread, this Dunning-Kruger effect, especially the ones who are not, by the way. Okay. So these new professionals start off with a very weak foundation in writing, then we force them to read mountains of really poor writing while they try to fake their way through, all the time believing that they are better than they are, and then they hit this obstacle. Plain writing is hard. Okay. The concepts might be easy, and we've talked back and forth. You know, I've heard a number of speakers over the past couple of days say, it's not this hard. These aren't hard concepts. It's not hard to do, but it is extremely time-consuming. Okay? Plain writing does take work if you are to do it very well and to develop those skills so that it starts to come naturally. And the trouble is, when you talk with students and with new lawyers, they think it's easy. Okay? We shorten some sentences, we use some simple words, a little bit of active voice, done, all plain, right? When and if they realize that it's not easy, they give up, they back off, they abandon it, and they do what they know is right because they're excellent writers, right? So the 5 obstacles, but still, in my view, the most significant obstacle to reaching professionals in a meaningful way is this. We all want to be part of the club. Think back to your first professional community. Okay? Maybe you were excited. Maybe you were confident. Maybe you were overly confident a little bit. But somewhere inside, most of us were afraid. Okay? And we were afraid of not being accepted. We were afraid of someone finding out that we didn't belong. We were afraid of not making it. And how do we prove that we belong? We try to blend in. We try to do what everyone else is doing. We take cues from those around us, those people who have proven themselves they're part of the club. If they wear blue suits, we wear blue suits. And in terms of communication, I'm sure this is a term that you're familiar with as well. That new group is often referred to as a discourse community. Okay. A discourse community, I don't often read from slides, but I think this is important, is a group of people who share a set of discourses understood as basic values and assumptions and ways of communicating about those goals. Doctors write like doctors, bankers write like bankers, lawyers write like lawyers. Okay. The best way to show that we belong to the club is to talk the way they talk and write the way they write, and then maybe they won't see that we don't belong. Okay. It's too much of a risk, especially for a new professional, to shun the rules of the club. Add to this the pressure of that supervising attorney insisting on legalese. These obstacles are almost impossible to overcome for someone in that position. Now, we continue to fight the fight, relying on logic and on data, but we're fighting emotion. We're fighting fear. And logic and data often do not connect with those fears. These tools can almost never overcome the emotions, the habits, and the internal beliefs that created the problem. So now I've covered these 6 obstacles, and I'd like to sort of start over. Some of you will get this, and I mean no disrespect. Hi, my name is Julie. As I prepared this talk, I was working, making a living, right? Like all of us, I had looming deadlines. And as is all too common, one of the attorneys that I was working for threw something at me, sent me an email. I need you to drop everything you're doing for me right now, and you need to file this. You need to finish this document right now. Stop what you're doing. It needs to be filed by 5 o'clock. Okay. I'd never written that document before. So I quickly scrambled to find a sample, and then I uploaded it to my computer, and I started frantically plugging in the details of our client's case so that I could get this thing filed by 5 o'clock, and this is how the sample started. Now come the petitioners, Sally and Tom Smith, and by and through their attorneys, Karen Cartwright, and in response to respondents' motion to allow telephone testimony of Pat Kelly, MD, respectfully request that this honorable tribunal deny that motion, and in support thereof, state the following. Okay. I hadn't been given nearly enough time to find the facts that I needed to support this response to a motion, okay, that needed to be plugged in there, and the citations to those facts, and the law. I don't even know I've never written a response to a motion like this, although I've written lots of responsive motions, and it needed to be filed by 5 o'clock, along with supporting documents. So I left this language in, along with other passages that were equally poorly written. I cringed. I knew that with just a few minutes, I could make this better. Okay? But I left it in because I didn't have one more minute. And truth be told, I've done it before, and I will do it again. Not proudly, but I will do it again. And it's not because I don't support this cause. Clearly I support this clause. It's not because I don't know how to write in plain English. I think I do. I've been practicing it for a long time. But in your lives, in my life, and especially in new professionals' lives, they often, more often than not, don't have one spare minute. Okay? So I can easily, maybe even smugly, criticize those who say that plain language isn't precise enough. We need to use terms of art. Okay, and I can get irritated and a little bit arrogant about those arguments. But who am I and who are we to sigh and roll our eyes when these new lawyers are faced with these emotions and are scared to death of failing as professionals? All they want to do is fit in. Who are we when we know they don't have one more second in the day to say that they need to do it our way? So don't get me wrong, I'll keep fighting the fight, as we all should, but merely fighting the fight and making logical arguments and teaching people to write clearly isn't enough. And by the way, how many of you have ever changed what you were doing and committed to because someone fought you to do so? Okay? So maybe we should reconsider the fighting the fight. Whoops. We can't continue to try to beat the world into submission. It doesn't work. Okay? We have to meet people where they are and welcome them into our version of what we see, how we see the world could be. And with that in mind, I would suggest the following as starting points. Acknowledge the challenges. Be candid but understanding about the challenges that these new professionals face. Help them to embrace great prose. Coach them to be better writers and lead by example. Provide the tools that they need. And I'm talking about clearly written samples of forms, of letters, of other documents that they might need to write. They're looking for those. They don't know how to start from scratch. They're looking for samples that they can use. And they're not out there. How many times have you looked for a sample of a document you've never drafted, and only to find that not a single form book, there's not a single good example in any of the form books, on the internet, anywhere. Every example is awful. So if our goal is to change the way others write, we need to provide them with the tools to do so, even if, and I'm aware of this, even if that means that we sometimes give up fees for our intellectual property, because we've got to get it out there somewhere. Celebrate the role models. Okay? Identify them and celebrate them and try to get their writing, like Justice Kirby, try to get their writing into those case books so that so students are reading more examples of, shining examples of legal writing. Okay? People who aren't merely in the club, but people who are leading the club. Hold those people up to these new professionals as the example instead of what we're holding up right now, which is all of the case books and the literature out there that's so poorly written. Then embrace them and bring them in and help enlist their help in changing things from the inside. Finally, lighten up. Okay? Cut them some slack, just a little. Empathize with the very real challenges they face and celebrate the small victories. Okay? Those of you who know me well know that I am the last person in this room who has any right to preach the lighten up sermon. Okay? But I also know it works. Okay? But if we are going to keep fighting the fight, then I'm going to leave you with two quotes, and I found them long after I turned this in, which was also very late. Sorry. The first quote comes from Sun Tzu. Okay, so these are going to be very different sources. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Okay. And the second, from a very different sort, Mahatma Gandhi. First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win. Okay? No matter where we are on this continuum and how frustrating it might be, we are winning. Thank you.